I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for November the 6th, 2025. Today on our Theology Roundup, we are concluding a two-part series we started yesterday discussing eating meat in an idolater's private home from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In discussions about the kosher dietary laws, this is a very difficult passage for many Messianics to sort through. And indeed, when we put our ministry's Messianic Kosher Helper together, here you have it, Messianic Kosher Helper, OutreachIsraelBookstore.com. When we originally put this resource together in 2014, there was not a whole lot on the whole subject of eat anything which is set before you. There was very little information, and this is a passage which, of course, we do need to discuss, not only for what it meant to its ancient recipients, but also for what it means to us today in possible contexts we may find ourselves. All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off. Let me switch screens really quickly. Okay, there we go. We're going to be going through 1 Corinthians 10, 25 through 33. Okay. 1 Corinthians 10, 25, and 26. With Paul having just asserted that believers need to be highly concerned with the spiritual edification of others, what follows in 1 Corinthians 10, 25 to 33 is a potential application of this for the Corinthians themselves. This section is admittedly difficult for many of today's Messianics who believe in the continued validity of the kosher dietary laws to understand and deduce possible 21st century applications for. In fact, those who are highly or even hypersensitive about what they eat frequently ignore this section of Paul's letter and may even at times cast doubt on what Paul had to say. Did the Apostle Paul cast aside the commandments of kashrut and or the apostolic decree by writing, "Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake? For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains." Psalm 24:1. 1 Corinthians 10, 25 and 26, New American Standard. Many readers take this statement as meaning that, at the very least, Paul considered the kosher dietary laws to be a matter of adiaphora, something which really does not matter the way a person views it, one way or another. The makellon is noted by the Thayer lexicon to actually be a Latin word, macellum, a place where meat and other articles of food are sold, meat market, provision market. A customary view of eat anything sold in the meat market, New International Version, present in evangelical Protestantism, is that the Corinthians were permitted to eat anything being sold in a public place, because if the meat had once been sacrificed to idols, any religious significance had apparently been lost by it ending up in a commercial venue. It is not difficult to find commentators who conclude that Paul's statement was apparently reflective of him believing that the kosher dietary laws had been abrogated, as is frequently seen among a selection of interpreters. We've got three here to review. F.F. Bruce, quote, "That Paul should give Christians carte blanche to eat whatever is sold in a pagan meat market shows how completely emancipated he was from Jewish obligations in the matter of food and how loosely he sat to the food restrictions of the Jerusalem decree, unquote. Richard B. Hayes, quote, presumably the weak at Corinth were arguing for the position almost universally held elsewhere in Orthodox Orthodox Christianity and in Judaism. Such meat was still idol meat, and it must be forbidden. At this point, however, Paul emphatically declares his agreement with the strong. You can eat anything sold in the market, unquote. And our last theologian, Ben Witherington III, quote, he no longer felt it necessary to keep kosher since all creatures and thus all meat are the Lord's, and thus one may freely share in it, unquote. Christian readers have customarily read 1 Corinthians 10:25 as the Apostle Paul, for certain, giving permission to the Corinthians to purchase meat which had been butchered in the pagan marketplace, regardless of whether or not it had been sacrificed to idols. In the Mishnah, one notably sees the ancient Jewish view that meat brought into an idol, presumably before an animal would have been sacrificed, would have been acceptable for eating if taken away before its death and slaughtered elsewhere. Yet the meat which came out of a pagan sacrifice would be prohibited. It is stated, meat which is being brought into an idol is permitted, but that which comes out is prohibited because it is like sacrifices of the dead. Psalm 106:28, the words of Rabbi Akiba. Mishnah Avodah Zarah 2:3. Regardless of the prior circumstances, which saw the meat arrive in the Corinthian marketplace, Paul was pushing things by stating, eat whatever is sold in the meat market. Complete Jewish Bible. Noting the widespread Jewish position on meat sacrifice to idols, the thought of Gordon D. Fee is that, quote, Paul takes a decidedly liberal stance on this issue. If the Jewish law allowed one to eat meat before it was offered to idols, but not afterward, Paul contended that its ultimate source was God himself, verse 26, and that it was therefore irrelevant whether it had been sacrificed or not. Thus, he tells the Corinthians to buy and eat, and to do so without raising questions of conscience. Apparently, it was possible in some cases, indeed it was required of the Jews, to investigate whether the meat in the Messianic had been previously sacrificed. So Paul is telling the Corinthians not to conduct such inquiries. Meat is meat, buy and eat, unquote. From this common conclusion, the issue of concern is necessarily raised regarding how the apostolic decree forbade the non-Jewish believers from eating things strangled and blood and from idolatry. Did this now no longer matter? On the one hand, it could possibly be argued that if in a metropolitan area like ancient Corinth, there were ever significant food shortages, that eating whatever was sold in the meat market was preferable to starving. This would fit with the ancient Jewish practice of pikuach nefesh, or regard for human life, where unclean things could be consumed in order to maintain or extend life. Roy E. Ciampa and Brian S. Rosner at least interject the thought, quote, to ask questions and refuse to eat food which is explicitly identified as idol food would seriously reduce the food options available, unquote. That there could be extenuating circumstances which might have required the Corinthians to eat unacceptable meat does need to be recognized. It also needs to be recognized that while there was a high possibility of meat being sold in the Messianic of originating from animals once offered in pagan sacrifice, that this did not have to be the case of all meat. In his commentary, Anthony C. Thistleton makes note of a study by M. Eisenberg, who, quote, argues on the basis of a first-century text, Vita Aesopi, that sacrificial and non-sacrificial meats were readily distinguishable, since the sacrificial meat would be valued more highly, unquote. In the later period of the 2nd century CE, Pliny the Younger would at least provide a clue that meat offered in sacrifice and meat which had not been involved in religious rites was sold together in the market, and both were identifiable as such. It is at any rate certain that temples which were almost abandoned have begun to be crowded, and the solemn rites which for long had been suspended are being restored. The flesh of the victims, for which up to now only a very occasional buyer was found, is now on sale in many places. Pliny, Letter to Trajan, 1096-10. Because most of the emerging Christian community in the Roman Empire would not purchase meat involved in idol sacrifices, apparently merchants selling the meat needed to provide an alternative. Tertullian would state, quote, how in all the world can that be the case with people who are living among you, eating the same food, wearing the same attire, having the same habits, under the same necessities of existence? From his Apology 42. If these believers would have been making use of the same basic marketplace as non-believers, then this can be taken as an indication that non-idol meat was available in many places of commerce. Of course, these factors cannot be held rigidly, but do need to be taken into consideration. Not all meat in the Corinthian marketplace of 1 Corinthians 10:25 had to be tainted by idolatry. One has to assume, when encountering 1 Corinthians 10:25, though, that the considerable bulk of the meat in the Corinthian marketplace had probably been involved with idolatry. So it is accurate to assume, for the Corinthian believers, as Fee would say, meat is meat, buy and eat. The argument that the Corinthians were to buy and eat whatever they pleased is one which has been eisegeted into the text. The clause, pon, ta, and makelo, polumenon, notably includes the present passive participle, polumenon, and is better rendered with, listen carefully, eat everything being sold in a meat market. Green's literal version, with the passive voice being sold, also represented by the Brown and Comfort and Marshall interlinear editions. The Apostle Paul did not say in 1 Corinthians 10:25, purchase and eat anything being sold in the meat market. His instruction was only to eat what was being sold. And in light of accepting or not accepting the invitation of a Corinthian non-believer, 1 Corinthians 10:27a, were the Corinthian believers, even those who would actually have been purchasing the meat in view. Thistleton is at least willing to recognize, quote, Paul is not necessarily addressing only those who make the actual purchases, rather than also those for whom others may have made the purchases, unquote. The Corinthian non-believers, being those who purchased the meat from the marketplace, who then might have served it as hosts to believers they invited into their homes, is the better way to take Paul's word. Eat anything that is being sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. 1 Corinthians 10:25, the author's rendering. The presence of Paul's quoting Psalm 24:1 and 1 Corinthians 10:26, the earth is the Lord's with its fullness, the world and all those, and those who dwell in it, World Messianic Bible, does beg a number of questions, which tend to be uncomfortable for many kosher-friendly Messianics. The flesh of the animals being sold was certainly made by the Creator God, and all creatures are inherently good to some degree or another. Likewise, the scene of various festal gatherings at the local shrine or pagan temple in Corinth was certainly not in view. F. Bruce is right to conclude, quote, even if the meat did come from a sacrificed animal, they are not going to eat it as part of an idolatrous feast or in company where they risk becoming partners with demons, unquote. The challenge is that Psalm 24:1 was often invoked to thank God for one's food in traditional Jewish blessing, as witnessed in both the Tosefta and Talmud. One must not taste anything until he has first recited a benediction over it, as Scripture states, the earth is the Lord's and all that it contains. Psalm 24:1. Tosefta Barakot 4:1. And said Rabbi Judah, said Samuel, whoever derives benefit in this world without reciting a blessing is as if he derived benefit from holy things that belong to heaven, and so has committed sacrilege. For it is said, the earth belongs to the Lord and everything that fills it. Psalm 24:1. Talmud Barakot 35a. And for said Rabbi Hia bar Abba, one time I was received as a guest in the home of a householder in Laodicea, and they brought before me a table of gold borne by 16 men. There were 16 silver chains fixed to it, with plates, goblets, pitchers, and flaxes set thereon, and on it there were all kinds of food, dainties, and spices. When they set it down, they cited the verse, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, Psalm 24:1. And when they took it away after the meal, they recited, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he has given to the children of men, Psalm 115:16. I said to them, my son, through what deeds do you enjoy the merit of enjoying such comfort? He said to me, I was a butcher, and out of every fine beast I said, may this be for the Sabbath. I said to him, happy are you that you have attained such merit, and blessed is the Omnipresent who has accorded you such merit. Talmud Shabbat 119a. Here, given the direction, eat anything being sold in a meat market, examining nothing because of conscience, 1 Corinthians 10:25, Green's literal version, coupled with the traditional Jewish blessing of Psalm 24:1, should the Corinthians have ever been served meat sacrificed to idols in a particular setting, 1 Corinthians 10:27, their default action was apparently to just ask God to bless what they were eating and then consume it. Fee states, quote, it is hard to imagine anything more un-Jewish in the apostle than this, unquote. David E. Garland, however, argues that Fee's statement is exaggerated, urging some temperance in the words. He instead thinks, quote, it is more accurate to say that he is nowhere more un-Pharisaic, since Pharisees spent considerable effort inquiring into the background and preparation of food, unquote. 1 Corinthians 10:27. Was the real reason why Paul had just stated to eat whatever was being sold in the meat market, 1 Corinthians 10:25, so that the Corinthian believers could disregard the apostolic decree? Readers who are careful to work through Paul's correspondence should note the specific conditions which are further stated to be in place, specifically as it concerned accepting an invitation to visit a non-believer's home and being served a meal. If a non-believer invites you over and you want to go, eat whatever is set before you, without raising questions of conscience. 1 Corinthians 10:27, Tree of Life version. A commentator like Fee is correct to assert, quote, Paul is absolutely forbidden attendance at temple meals, unquote, but the scene or venue here is dining, quote, in a pagan home, unquote. If a non-believer wanted to demonstrate his hospitality to one of the Corinthian believers, and it might especially have been a chance to testify of Yeshua the Messiah, then such instruction was to go and eat what was served. Such Corinthian non-believers would have been those who frequented the local meat market, purchasing fare to serve their guests, which may have come from idolatrous sacrifices. Hayes, who does think that the Corinthians could purchase whatever meat they want in the market, 1 Corinthians 10:25, goes on to connect this with 1 Corinthians 10:27, detailing, quote, he tells them they can eat whatever is served to them in the home of an unbeliever without conducting any inquiries about the source of the meat, unquote. J. Paul Sampley makes the appropriate linguistic connections between 1 Corinthians 10:25-27, which serves to support that it was the Corinthian non-believers and not the believers who purchased what was being sold at the meat market. Quote, the same wording used in 10:25, pan, aestheta, eat anything, with the everything placed first for emphasis. Without any problems for your moral consciousness, urges the believer to feel conscience-free to eat whatever is placed before him or her, unquote. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament entry on Makellon or meat market, 1 Corinthians 10:25, notably associates what is being sold to the believer visiting with a pagan. This term means enclosure, then market. Markets are rectangular courts with a dome-shaped roof, a fountain in the middle, booths at the side, and perhaps a room for sacrificial repasts. In 1 Corinthians 10:25, Paul uses the word when he tells the Christians at Corinth how to act relative to meat sold on the market, which might well come from pagan temples, but might also be the only meat readily available. Paul's advice is that one is to eat without asking questions, for everything is the Lord's. Only when unbelievers say that the meat has been offered in pagan sacrifice should one refrain for their sake. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Thistleton properly indicates, quote, the meat almost certainly will be what had been offered in a temple, especially since the host serves good quality fare, unquote. But how might it be made known to the Corinthian believer visiting a pagan home if the meat had indeed been sacrificed to an idol? There are a number of options, but specifically inquiring of one's host about the meat is not one of them. More than likely, some blessing, accolade, or toast to a pagan deity could have been witnessed during the preparation of the meal or overheard as the meal was being served. Enough clues could have been dropped regarding the source of meat being offered by one's host. When one sees Paul's word, if some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put in front of you without raising questions of conscience. 1 Corinthians 10:27, Complete Jewish Bible. There should be little doubting the fact that he was pushing the envelope of much first-century Jewish convention. While Paul was favorable toward believers accepting an invitation to dine at a non-believer's private home, many of Paul's Jewish contemporaries would often have turned down invitations to eat at a Greek or Roman's home. In the view of Craig S. Keener in his InterVarsity Press Bible Background Commentary, quote, when people were invited to banquets in wealthy homes, they could not be certain of the meat source. Jewish people who avoided impure foods, like pork, were virtually excluded from banquets, but they did not look down on Gentiles who ate pork as long as they abstained from idols. Jewish people had sometimes faced martyrdom to avoid eating impure foods, and they would expect Gentiles who claimed to believe in God at least to avoid food that had certainly been offered to idols." Unquote. Keener's further thought, as seen in his 1st and 2nd Corinthians commentary, is that in accepting an invitation to dine at a non-believer's home, quote, "what they did not know would not hurt them." 10:25-27. Indeed, even scrupulous Jewish teachers considered inadvertent sins comparatively light, although they might not have adopted Paul's "don't ask, don't tell" approach. Unquote. Passively eating of meat, which had been involved in idolatry, was a far less crime than murder or fornication, presumably being at the same level, such as eating the flesh of an animal which had been mauled. Leviticus 20, verses 22-26, a Torah infraction which did not merit capital punishment. The overriding issue, per the intention of the apostolic decree of severing the new, non-Jewish believers from their previous spheres of social and religious influence, Acts 15, 19-21, is that interaction with the larger Greco-Roman world was not going away, as demonstrated by what to do when invited to a pagan home to eat. Garland does interject, quote, "Paul's advice reveals that he had no intention of cutting believers off entirely from their pagan family, neighbors, and associates." 5:9-13, also Luke 10:8. Paul does not expect his readers to cut themselves off completely from the fabric of all social relationships. Unquote. Relationships of some kind have to be established in order for the good news of Israel's Messiah to be declared and received. The hypothetical scene of 1 Corinthians 10:27. If a pagan asks you to dinner and you want to go, Philip's New Testament, goes beyond the Acts 10 encounter of the Apostle Peter having eaten with the centurion Cornelius. The Apostle Paul was detailing the acceptance of an invitation to eat at a pagan home. Cornelius had been a God-fearer, associated to some degree with the Jewish synagogue, and would not have served meat sacrificed to idols. What Paul was describing went beyond the controversy which Peter stirred, Acts 11, 1-18, when eating with the uncircumcised. In the estimation of Leon Morris, quote, "When invited by a pagan, a Christian is at liberty to accept and to eat whatever is provided without asking where it came from. That is his host's business." Unquote. What can often get overlooked is how, speaking hypothetically, Paul did not require it of the Corinthians to always accept an invitation to eat at a pagan home. Noting his view of 1 Corinthians 9, 20-22 preceding, Fee draws the conclusion, quote, "The acceptance of such invitations is perfectly legitimate," another place where he would be treading on sacred Jewish traditions. Tosefta Avodah Zarah 4:6. "It depends on whether you want to go." There would certainly have been occasions, if an invitation was issued, where it would not at all be advantageous for a Corinthian believer to go dine at a non-believer's home. Yet, unlike many of his Jewish contemporaries, because of the interest of the good news being declared to all, Paul was broadly dismissing sentiments like those of Jubilees 22:16. "And you also, my son Jacob, remember my words and keep the commandments of Abraham your father. Separate yourself from the Gentiles and do not eat with them, and do not perform deeds like theirs, and do not become associates of theirs, because their deeds are defiled and all of their ways are contaminated and despicable and abominable." Jubilees 22:16. It can be recognized, at least, how there was a permissive stance in terms of eating meat in the possession of a non-Jew among some in Paul's contemporary Judaism, as the Tosefta records. Meat which is found in the possession of a Gentile is permitted for gain. If it is found in the possession of a Mene, it is permitted for gain. That which goes forth from a pagan temple, lo, it is deemed to be meat from the sacrifices of corpses. Tosefta Chulin 2:20. Paul sat in a parallel course to this, as the believers may have eaten from what was served them, not asking about where it came from. A bigger issue, especially in light of how Paul had just asked his audience whether or not they intended to arouse the Lord to jealousy, is whether or not he was treading on violating the tenor of Exodus 34:15. Don't make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, lest they play the prostitute after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and one call you, and you eat of his sacrifice. World Messianic Bible. This is where the venue of a private home and being inadvertently served idol meat at a mealtime has to be differentiated from going to a local temple or shrine and knowingly partaking of meat which had been sacrificed to an idol. Yet, in 1 Corinthians 10:27, it may be observed how Paul has pushed the apostolic decree and Torah prohibitions as far as they can go, without willful and conscious involvement in idolatry being present. In their summary on what is being discussed, Ciampa and Rosner conclude that Paul's approach in accepting an invitation to dine at a non-believer's home was consistent with the spirit of the Exodus 34:15 instruction, albeit being to the left of how most of his fellow Jews would have read it. Quote, Paul's more detailed instructions, verses 28 to 30, suggest that he has a simple dinner invitation in mind, and that the believer was to be careful to avoid eating any food that was explicitly identified as having been offered to an idol. This clearly does not follow the Jewish tradition, but still may be understood as a more liberal approach to avoiding association with pagan sacrifices, and thus in the spirit of Exodus 34:15, while still allowing believers to maintain and develop social relationships with their non-believing neighbors, unquote. 1 Corinthians 10:28 to 30. While the Corinthian believer was not to inquire of the source of the meat when eating at a pagan home, the source of the meat may very well have been publicly stated during the meal. Paul directed, but if anyone says to you, this is from an idol sacrifice, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. 1 Corinthians 10:28, Tree of Life version. Here, in the words, eon detis humin epe, epe notably being an aorist active subjunctive, Paul was speaking widely in hypothetical terms. Paul was presenting a scenario where the edification of others and mission of the body of Messiah were in play. As Witherington concludes, quote, we have an, if perhaps, with a subjunctive verb. But if perhaps anyone may say, here Paul is dealing with a hypothetical possibility, one that his audience has not asked about, unquote. The Corinthian believers, as a matter of respect to the host, were simply not supposed to ask about what they were served, while the main issue regarding the source of the meat served would be whether it was sacrificed to idols or not, animals employed in Greco-Roman sacrifice, while technically involving clean animals like cattle, sheep, goats, or various fowl, could notably have also included unclean animals like swine. Eating what was served before oneself would also have pertained to various meat ingredients possibly used in side dishes. The difficult thing for today's Messianics to consider is that with 1 Corinthians 10:27 in view, the meat could have been from animals listed as clean or unclean on the lists of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, when served to a Corinthian believer by a local pagan in his home. If served meat, which was technically clean or unclean, it was to be eaten. It was not to be refused unless publicly known to be sacrificed to an idol. In the event that if a Corinthian Messiah follower went to the home of a pagan friend or even family member and discovered out that meat served was presented before idols, then Paul was clear that for conscience' sake, he or she was to refuse the meal. Morris draws the interesting conclusion. This is in sharp contrast to the Jewish approach. Jews were very scrupulous and made searching inquiries before they would eat meat. Paul's attitude was revolutionary. He took seriously the truth that an idol is nothing. He discouraged over scrupulousness, unquote. There was a point where the presumed quote-unquote knowledgeable addressed in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 would be correct, where the power of the one true God was overwhelmingly superior to any idols and certainly superior to the flesh of animals created by him. 1 Corinthians 10:24, whether clean or unclean. This power did not permit participation and eating in a local temple or shrine. This power may permit eating at the private home of a non-believer. Yet, while being overly scrupulous in such a setting was something which Paul discouraged, a Corinthian believer might have found other ways to eat, especially in thinking how any meat items had likely once been pagan sacrifices. Siant Ben Rosner summarized the possibilities. Quote, Paul is probably assuring that the meal, as would be typical, might be one in which many different food choices were being passed around. The Christian would not have to go without food altogether, but could choose from those items that had not been explicitly associated with an idol. If the Christian could not simply choose strategically from the food offered at the dinner, they might feel the need from time to time to excuse him or herself from the dinner, unquote. When circumstances arose where it was public knowledge at the meal that the meat had once been sacrificed to idols, it was then to be refused. Paul interjected, though, how it was not for your own conscience, but for the other person's. 1 Corinthians 10:29a, Tree of Life version. Some believers, in finding out that meat served at someone's private home had been sacrificed to idols, would realize how the God of Israel is all-powerful and that willful participation in idolatry was not occurring. Yet at the same time, if the Corinthian Messiah followers discovered that they were served meat sacrificed to idols, it was to be refused on account of what it was likely to have communicated to others. Witherington rightly says, quote, if one would go ahead and eat, then the host would see that as a violation of one's own religion. It would be a bad witness to that person, unquote. Here, the errant Corinthian slogan in action, all things are permitted, could certainly have backfired if a Corinthian believer continued eating once knowledge of where meat originated was stated. Fellowship with the Corinthian non-believers had some definite risks, as pagans might have thought that willful participation in their religion was occurring on the part of the believers. It is not agreed among interpreters how the statements following in 1 Corinthians 10:29b to 30 should be approached. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I give thanks for? Tree of Life version. Surely, if many things at least are permitted for Messiah followers, then accepting the hospitality of a Greek or Roman non-believer to dine should not have been something which one was slandered or condemned for. There is disagreement whether 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30 were words which Paul was employing to speak for how he himself had eaten idol meat in a pagan home before and was having to defend himself, or if the I, that's the pronoun I, being referred to was an emphatic I, or a usage of impersonation as a hypothetical I, similar to the I center of Romans chapter 7, where many, myself included, believe that Paul was not speaking of himself. Or even if 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30 was a quotation or reference from the Corinthians' correspondence to Paul. Garland summarizes his view that the I who spoke in 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30 was not the Apostle Paul having to defend past actions, but was instead an emphatic usage. Garland does not believe that Paul would have ever knowingly eaten meat sacrificed to idols, and that I should not necessarily be thought to refer to Paul directly. I, once again, being the pronoun I. Quote, some take these questions to reflect Paul's self-defense of his own past actions, perhaps in Corinth, and claim that he anticipates some Corinthians challenging his own inconsistency and condemning them for eating idol food in temples while he ate the same idol food sold in the meat market. I am convinced that Paul never ate idol food that was known to be idol food, and so would have no need to defend himself. Paul may have used the I for the sake of vividness when a more universal application is in view, thus presenting himself as a paradigmatic example for his readers, unquote. Garland makes reference to Daniel B. Wallace's massive resource, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, which describes, quote, on a rare occasion, the first person singular may be used for the sake of vividness when a more universal application is in view. Normally, such a usage is inclusive of the first person. Thus, I, the pronoun I, would mean something like all of us, but apparently it can also be used in an exclusive way. I would mean others, but not myself, unquote. Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. To an extent, this approach is reflected in the Thistleton rendering of 1 Corinthians 10, 29b and 30. For why, you ask, is my freedom being subjected to another person's self-awareness? Well, if I take part in a meal with Thanksgiving, why should I suffer defamation of character over that for which I at least give thanks? 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, New International Greek Testament Commentary. A significant alternative to the I, once again, that's the pronoun I, of 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, involving some form of impersonation, is to take these statements as being quotations or references to things which the Corinthians had asked Paul, perhaps even being a continuation of the slogan, all things are permitted, from 1 Corinthians 10, 23. This is the view which Witherington proposes. Quote, this is again the objection of the Corinthians, as in verse 23a, and does not represent Paul's own view. Paul himself has just argued that he does limit his freedom, and the Corinthians ought to limit theirs precisely because of someone else's conscience. Thus, verse 30 would also be a further hypothetical rhetorical question from the Corinthians to Paul. Paul's answer is, because it is not just a matter of one's relationship with God, it is not purely a vertical matter. There are also the horizontal relationships. That is the effect one's eating has on others, unquote. Interestingly enough, the rendering seen in the Complete Jewish Bible, Revised English Bible, and God's New Covenant edition by Heinz Kassirer reflects the view that 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30 might be correspondence being quoted from Paul. So we're going to take a look at these. However, I don't mean your conscience, but that of the other person. You say, quote, why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? If I participate with thankfulness, why am I criticized over something for which I myself bless God? Unquote. 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, Complete Jewish Bible. Not your conscience, I mean, but his. Quote, what, unquote, you say? Quote, is my freedom to be called in question by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I blamed for eating food over which I have said grace? Unquote. 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, Revised English Bible. And the last one. By his own conscience, I mean, not yours. Quote, what, unquote, you say? Quote, is my freedom of action to be called in question by another's conscience? If it is with thanksgiving that I partake of such food, why should I incur reproach over that for which I give thanks? Unquote. 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, God's New Covenant by Cassirer. Both the employment of 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30 as impersonation via a hypothetical I, that's the pronoun I, with Paul addressing why a believer had to be careful with his or her liberty, or a quotation or reference to what the Corinthians had been communicating to Paul, certainly lessen the potential problems which exist if Paul himself had been blatantly caught violating the principles of the apostolic decree. Still, even with 1 Corinthians 10, 29b to 30, possibly separated out in English translation in quotation marks, Paul might have been stating something which was only in the minds of those Corinthians who incorrectly believed all things are permitted. First Corinthians 10, 31 to 33. Born-again believers cannot just do anything, as Paul made it clear. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10, 31. Living fully for God is the thrust of the Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5 Shema. And as David exclaimed in Psalm 63, 1, God, you are my God. I will earnestly seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. World Messianic Bible. With doxon theou in view, there are obviously limits as to how far one can go with fellowshipping or interacting with non-believers. In many cases, while the invitation to eat at the home of a non-believer's table would have been good, as one could have shared the good news, the chance that it would negatively affect others could have required it to be turned down. When born-again believers conduct themselves in a manner which brings glory to God, then it is conducted with the prime example of Yeshua the Messiah, particularly as the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, 11 and 12, in conscious attention. Eating or drinking or performing any other actions take place with care for others' needs and edification being imperative. Romans 15, 1 through 6, 2 Corinthians 5, 14 through 21, Philippians 2, 1 through 22. Noting the presence of glory or doxa in verse 31, Thistleton further elaborates, quote, in this epistle, Paul at times uses the word doxa, glory, in its Hebrew sense, the Septuagint translation of kavod, as that which makes something impressive, weighty, or radiant with splendor. 1 Corinthians 15, 40, 41, 43. Yet for Paul, as for John, that which most startlingly displays God's impressive splendor is precisely his self-giving in which the Lord of glory is crucified. The biblical background is enhanced by the prominence of the categories of honor and shame which characterized Corinthian culture and the Greco-Roman world, unquote. Paul was concerned with the Corinthians not unnecessarily offending anyone, directing them, give no offense either to Jewish or Greek people or to God's community. 1 Corinthians 10:32, Tree of Life version. He recognized for himself how I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, so that they may be saved. 1 Corinthians 10:33, New Revised Standard. Showing them appropriate honor. Romans 12:10, a resource which is too frequently not shown to one's fellow human beings. But even while a level of self-identification with the potential audience is good, 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, it is obviously something which has to be kept within appropriate boundaries. Everything which one does in terms of seeing people brought to salvation must be done via the rubric of imitating Yeshua, 1 Corinthians 11:1. In the estimation of a commentator like Witherington, quote, Paul strives to fit in with everyone, not for his own benefit so that things will go smoothly for himself, but in order to save many for Christ. He is not trying to be a people pleaser in a way that would amount to compromising the gospel, but in indifferent matters such as food, he is more than happy to be socially easy to get along with, unquote. To a figure like the Apostle Paul, not causing unnecessary offense meant eating what was served to oneself after having accepted an optional invitation to eat at the home of a non-believer, 1 Corinthians 10:27. No questions were to be asked as to where the meat served originated, which meant that it could very well have been sacrificed to idols and or been from unclean animals. Only when it became public knowledge was meat to be refused. 1 Corinthians 10:28. If any temporary infraction of the Torah's dietary code took place, then it was because of the much higher issue of demonstrating gratitude to one's pagan host. As Paul said, I don't just do what is best for me, I do what is best for others so that many may be saved. 1 Corinthians 10:33, New Living Translation. Okay. All right, so 1 Corinthians 10:14-33. And this is the application section. In my family's experience, being involved in the Messianic movement since 1995, and being involved in full-time ministry since 2002, one would think that among all the passages surrounding the topic of kosher, Mark 7, 1-23, or Acts 10, 1-48, or Colossians 2, 16-23, or 1 Timothy 4, 1-5, would have witnessed the most controversy. Actually, the one statement which has witnessed more tension than any other has been Paul's assertion of 1 Corinthians 10:27. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put in front of you without raising questions of conscience. Complete Jewish Bible. This is not only true of what it meant for Paul's ancient readers, but most especially for how it is to be, or at least can be, applied in a 21st century context. Yeshua the Messiah himself directed his ancient followers, into whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat the things that are set before you. Luke 10:8, World Messianic Bible. When his followers would travel around the countryside, declaring the good news of the kingdom, they would have often been at the mercy of others for beneficence. And being welcomed into various homes, they needed to be very grateful for whatever hospitality was shown them. And so Yeshua said, remain in that same house, eating and drinking the things they give. Luke 10:7a, World Messianic Bible. These homes, however, would have been Jewish homes, where the Torah's dietary code would have been honored. The Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 10, 25 to 33, concerning a responsible exercise of a believer's liberty, were delivered with a similar intention. The acceptance of an invitation to a non-believer's home to dine was so that some kind of a relationship could be developed. This had the specific intention of seeing others brought to saving faith in Israel's Messiah. In discussing my personal evaluation that when Paul said, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience, 1 Corinthians 10:27, English Standard Version, that this would mean that when served meat sacrificed to idols, the Corinthians would have to eat it, including beef, lamb, goat, various fowl, or pork. I can tell you that I have had significant negative exchanges from adherents of a one law or one Torah theology. They have retorted to me that the issue was exclusively meat sacrificed to idols and not one of clean and unclean. They are correct to point out how many of the animals involved in Greco-Roman sacrifice would have been listed as quote-unquote clean in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. They seemingly forget, though, that swine were used in such religious practices as well. 1 Maccabees 1:47. The Corinthian believers were not to directly inquire as to the source of the meat served them, meaning they were not to inquire what meat it would have been either. Sometimes beef, lamb, goat, or pork is visibly indistinguishable when cooked, and depending on how it is cooked, can be indistinguishable to the taste of many palates. Claiming that only eating the flesh of animals classified as clean, yet had been sacrificed to idols, but not eating the flesh of animals classified as unclean, makes little sense when these believers would have been served something from their pagan host which they were not to ask questions about. Quite contrary to this, I have had much better discussions with various Messianic Jewish friends and acquaintances, particularly those who have been involved in missionary outreaches to underdeveloped countries and regions. These are people who do keep a kosher style of diet, and they do not believe that the Torah's code of clean and unclean meats has been completely abrogated in the post-resurrection era. Yet, these people, in recognizing the hospitality which a non-believer, perhaps still engrossed in a tribal paganism, would have in presenting a meal to a foreign guest with a foreign religion, would certainly eat what would be set on their plate by their host. Whether it be pork, shellfish, or insects, the fare would be eaten with no questions asked. This does not mean that the missionary would necessarily ask for more, nor does it mean that if the missionary had the option of choosing what to eat and what not to eat, that obviously unclean things would be consumed. And with 1 Corinthians 10:14 to 33 recognized, when it would be discovered that the meat was involved with a pagan ritual, it is then refused as a high violation of biblical directives. Obviously, for some in the Messianic community, eating unclean things served by one's host, with particular circumstances in play and as a matter of respecting another's hospitality, is something entirely unacceptable. These persons would apparently have an issue with the tenor of Paul's instruction in 1 Corinthians 10, where the venue of eating a meal at the home of a non-believer was in view, and the need to develop relationships for another's potential salvation would be imperative. Fare was only to be refused, according to Paul, when it became publicly known that meat was once an idol sacrifice. Others in the Messianic community, while not at all looking for loopholes around eating kosher, similar to the Corinthian believers eating in a pagan home, find it necessary to just eat whatever their host sets before them out of accepting their genuine hospitality, temporarily suspending things like kosher eating for the needs of the moment may be necessary. It is tactful to recognize how Paul's word, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the ground of conscience, 1 Corinthians 10:27, Revised Standard Version, would have sat to the left of center of the stipulations of the apostolic decree, Acts 15, 20, 29. But this would have been a far cry from the ancient Corinthians participating in sins such as idolatry, to the point of eating any kind of meat that was knowingly sacrificed to idols, which was to Paul unacceptable. It was a bad witness to non-believers once a believer found out the meat originated from the pagan temple. Many of us today, however, when visiting the home of a non-believer we are trying to get to know, might have pork or shellfish served to us on a plate. Well, some might choose to eat around the meat and may actually be able to say that this disagrees with my stomach. A situational prudence as a matter of gratitude to one's host might require some to simply eat without complaining. Such a thought that Messianic believers, if served unkosher fare, might have to eat it, does run contrary to the sentiments of those for whom keeping the kosher dietary laws is sometimes put on par with basic morality and love for neighbor. Nowhere did the Apostle Paul allow for the Corinthians to participate in idolatry, which is a capital offense in the Torah. Eating unclean things is not a capital offense, however, as the Lord only said, "You shall not eat any abomination," Deuteronomy 14:3, Art Scroll, ultimately placing one's being abhorrent, New Jewish Publication Society version, as a personal condition. Eating unclean things set before oneself is considered by the scriptures themselves to be on a different level than committing idolatry and denying the God of Israel. At the very most, would any Corinthians have been served unclean things, the worst thing they would really have experienced could have been indigestion and a state of temporary uncleanness, the same as any of us today. The Torah does not classify what one eats at the level of high offenses like idolatry, sexual immorality, or murder. And unless one holds to an impossibly rigid application of Moses' teaching, there are life exceptions to the rules of kashrut, as indicated by the conditional invitation of Corinthian believers being asked to the home of a non-believer, 1 Corinthians 10, 27 and 28. An invitation which could have been turned down by many of them. Nowhere in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 did Paul uphold the slogan, "All things are permitted," 1 Corinthians 10:23, because he certainly did not allow, once it was discovered, for the Corinthians to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Unfortunately, in much of contemporary Christianity, the maxim of "all things are permitted" now includes much, much more than what one might be served at a non-believer's dinner table. My family has kept a biblically kosher style of diet since 1996, eliminating pork and shellfish from what we eat, as well as being sensitive to various Messianic Jewish concerns. In our time of eating this way, we have, like many Messianic people, undoubtedly been served things at a family member's or friend's house or at some other social gathering, which has had pork or shellfish as an unknown ingredient. By far, the bulk of Messianic people eating something unclean takes place because it is unknown. Only on a small handful of occasions, normally in the home of an unreligious person who would not understand the kosher dietary laws for any man or woman of faith, have I eaten pork when it has been served to me. Like Paul would direct, I thank the Lord for his bounty, 1 Corinthians 10:26, and I do not ask questions, 1 Corinthians 10:27, but I do not seek seconds. To make too much of an issue about what I am eating could be taken by one's host to be ungrateful for the time and effort they have spent in providing a meal for me, and which is worse, for me to be concerned about my eating or not being concerned about the honor they deserve as human beings. While it behooves one who emulates Yeshua, 1 Corinthians 11:1, to obey the Father's instruction, the command to love neighbor, Leviticus 19:18, has a higher priority than kashrut. Perhaps in the future, as relationships are developed, your eating preferences can be discussed along with a whole range of other biblical issues. But for a short moment, the other person's hospitality has to be respected. All right, and so that concludes our two-part analysis of 1 Corinthians 10, 14 to 33. And as I have said, this is not a passage which tends to be discussed that well in a great deal of the Messianic community. Many people don't consider the place of others in terms of the hospitality they demonstrate, in terms of their attitudes, in terms of wanting to genuinely honor those who take the time to prepare a meal for them and want to demonstrate a degree of honor to them. So everyone's situation is different, but unfortunately, there are people who think that the kosher dietary laws are on the same level as the Ten Commandments, which they are not. All of us from time to time, Messianic Jewish believers will definitely attest to this. People are going to be served something unclean. Most of the time, it's without their specific knowledge. It might simply be something like pepperoni hidden under the cheese, right, on pizza. But frequently, there will be ways to find out what is in a dish being served. Frequently, it certainly is going to take place for many people with this upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. Food is going to be served in some kind of a buffet. And so it's really easy to eat around or avoid eating something unclean. This probably won't be the last time we talk about this. All right, let me switch over screens. Once again, this has been taken from our ministry's massive publication, the Messianic Kosher Helper, available in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle, outreachisraelbookstore.com. And one of the reasons we have these discussions is so we can avoid legalism, we can avoid being inflexible, and of course, we can focus on what really matters, loving God and loving neighbor. And if we can do that, then everything else should be able to fall right into place. All right, so that concludes our theology roundup. Let's move over now to our news roundup. And of course, we do our news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. Along with that, we are reminded, number one, to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, pray for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, which, of course, we're still sorting through the election on Tuesday for mayor in New York City, a number of other governorships, and a number of other things. We are also continuing to sort through the fallout from the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes interview. And we are seeing a rise of anti-Semitism, but most especially anti-Zionism from not just the progressive left, but also the conservative right. And how does this affect us as today's Messianic people? Are we paying attention to this at all? There's some very serious things we've got to be monitoring and to be praying about, be taking before the throne of grace, because there are significant road signs we're witnessing right now, which indicate, and we do not want to be presumptuous, but we also have to be realistic, that we're taking some leaps forward toward the second coming of Yeshua. And how many people are just not paying attention. All right, so all the links I'm about to go through, these should be available later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. So if you want to read the specific articles, watch the specific clips, you can do so. All right, so we start out with this from the 5th of November, open source intel. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, and she's the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year and then dedicated it to Donald Trump. Iran, Russia, and China now operate militarily, technologically, and through intelligence in Venezuela, just 3 hours from Florida. A transition to democracy would dismantle this presence and make Venezuela a strong security ally of the United States. And that's for 30 seconds. And indeed, one of the things which I know people don't want to talk about, but we kind of have to. It is true. What's happened in Venezuela is an absolute disaster. When I lived in Florida, we knew some people at our Messianic congregation who had fled the regime in Venezuela. Venezuela used to be a paradise, and it was an economic powerhouse. And yes, Venezuela has got more oil than Saudi Arabia. So it would be foolish not to think of this entirely in terms of politics. There's also the economic factor as well. But this is in the United States' backyard. Do we know what's going to happen yet? No, but we do have to keep this in mind because what has happened to Venezuela, and we know people again who had to flee Venezuela. It is a great tragedy. Okay, this is from My Charisma yesterday. It's a worthwhile, perusal. New York's election reveals the prophetic alignment of nations. So you got a lot of people, of course, they're responding to the election of Zoran Mamdani. And here you see a little video that features Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes. So people are definitely responding. Zoran Mamdani won the New York mayoral election last night. Of course, this is from yesterday. That is not just a political result if Stakelbeck, that's Eric Stakelbeck here, is right. He described Mamdani in advance as an Islamic communist who is viciously anti-Israel. This is not subtle. New York, the financial capital of the world, is now governed by someone who openly rejects the foundation of Judeo-Christian Western civilization. And then he mentions, while this happens, the right is busy attacking Israel. Instead of focusing on this ideological takeover, Stakelbeck said a faction on the right is choosing to fight Israel, mentioning Tucker Carlson. So anyway, this is a good thing to just peruse because people in the conservative Christian world, they are reacting to what is just taking place in New York. We do know that there are going to be a lot of people who end up leaving New York, not just Jewish people, but other people. I saw today that there's a post going around on social media from a lady who's a realtor in South Florida. Her phone is literally ringing off the hook right now from people in New York wanting to move to South Florida. We also know that Texas is definitely a place which is likely to receive a lot of people leaving New York. And what's going to happen to all the businesses as well? All right, so speaking of New York, here's a story from the New York Post yesterday. I'm sorry about the fonts here, but I use the DuckDuckGo browser for our news roundup. But the headline is Jewish Fire Department of New York Commissioner hands in resignation morning after anti-Israel Zoran Mamdani elected mayor. So the Fire Commissioner of New York, Robert Tucker, he turned in his resignation. And indeed, there are probably going to be various other people who turn in their resignation or leave in the period between now and Mamdani's inauguration. And they're probably not all going to be Jewish either. But yeah, this is serious. Also from the New York Post, this is from Instagram. New York City Jewish groups vow to hold hostile Zoran Mamdani accountable. Normalization of anti-Semitism just got very loud. New York City Jewish organizations grappling with anti-Israel Zoran Mamdani's stunning mayoral victory Tuesday night have vowed to hold the mayor-elect fully accountable. Okay, we're definitely going to be monitoring what Zoran Mamdani does very closely. A lot of parallels have been made between his election in New York and the election of Zadik Khan in London. and what's going to be changing in the coming months and year in New York City. All right, to just kind of break this up, this is from Newsmax yesterday on Instagram, the 5th of November. Tom Brady reveals his new dog is a clone of his late pet. Seeing double, Tom Brady revealed that his dog, Junie, is a genetic clone of his late pit bull mix, Lua, who passed away in December 2023. All right, so not really getting into more of the specifics of that. If your pet dog or your cat died, would you seek some kind of a genetic clone of it? Now, I'm sure this is something which was not inexpensive by any means. So in the event that Kitty passed away, would we get a clone of Kitty? Probably not. But this is something which has become more and more frequent. Some of you all may remember the film. I believe it was probably over 25 years ago with Arnold Schwarzenegger, called The Sixth Day. And there was this retail store called Repet, which basically was, hey, look, when your pet's getting ready to die, they are able to take your pet's memories, clone your pet, and you'll be able to have a repet, right? And one of the themes of that show, of that film, was that yes, while cloning of pets was going on openly and it was a huge business, they're also cloning human beings on the side, even though it was, not something to be done. And the whole premise of the movie was that Arnold Schwarzenegger's character himself was a clone of himself. So I haven't seen it for a long time, so I apologize if I got some of the details wrong. But look, if pets are being openly cloned, there are doubtlessly some questions to be raised about what kind of experimentation is being done with human beings, right? And, we're dealing with headlines which are, we're not looking on the, alt left or the alt right. We're dealing with things which are in the mainstream. Okay, moving on. Back to the whole topic of the New York mayoral election. So here we see, this is from November the 5th, yesterday. Brooklyn's Jewish community wakes up to 2 swastikas at Magen David Yeshiva in Gravesend. While New York Police Department hate crimes investigates, the mayor-elect must unequivocally condemn this hateful graffiti. Time to represent and protect all New Yorkers. And here you see Elise Stefanik, who is, she's running for the governor of New York. She's Republican. The day after New York City elects a pro-Hamas anti-Semite for mayor, Nazi swastikas are found painted on the walls of Magen David Yeshiva in Brooklyn. This is reprehensible and unacceptable and should serve as a wake-up call that Mamdani is ushering in the pro-terrorist anti-Semitic takeover of New York City, aided and abetted by the worst governor in America, Kathy Hochul. Okay, that's her opinion. But yeah, there are going to be a lot of people, both in and outside New York State, who are going to be watching what happens very, very closely. All right, so here's a clip. Some of you all may have seen it on social media. Okay, yes, that gentleman has got blue hair, so he would be the kind of New Yorker you'd expect to be rather progressive. New Yorkers already know they messed up. I'm on the subway going home, and it feels like I'm at a wake. People are shocked. This is not Cuomo supporters. This is New York cross-section. And the commentary here is, this is the calm before the storm. Okay, and once again, because New York, the Big Apple, is, it's the #1 city in the United States. They've just elected an Islamic mayor. How is that going to change the dynamic, and what is going to be seen? Yeah, yesterday was not a great day for any of us. We could feel the cloud over us in the spirit, for certain. Okay, from Leading Report, breaking President Trump on Mamdani. We lost a little bit of sovereignty last night in New York, but we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. November the 5th, 1:30 p.m. So, all right, we'll see how the president acts to this. Okay, so our next story, and this is something you probably have already seen, so we're just going to briefly cover it. This is a clip from Charlie Kirk, 1 minute, 14 seconds. Zohran Mamdani becoming New York City mayor in Charlie Kirk words coming true. 2 days before he was assassinated, he said the left will use Islam to bring down America. Now, one of the things Charlie Kirk is quoted as saying is, the American way of life is very simple. I want to be able to get married, buy a home, have kids, allow them to ride their bikes till the sun goes down, send them to a good school, have a low crime neighborhood, not to have my kid be taught the lesbian, gay, transgender garbage in their school, while also not having them have to hear the Muslim call to prayer 5 times a day. That's important. So the question is, and not that those are not good things, and that they're not good things worth fighting for, because they are. But when do those things, especially for believers, become things that young men and young women believe they are entitled to, which they are not? And number 2, when they become idols, which we seek after, rather than we step back and we ask the Lord, when are we in human history, and what am I supposed to be aligning with in order to serve the interests and purposes of your kingdom? See, those are the kinds of things that our family, me in particular, when my father died on September the 1st, 1992, we had to give up. When my mother got remarried in 1994, and then when we got involved in the Messianic movement 30 years ago in 1995, we have been operating on a very different footing. And we've had to put things aside that a lot of people believe they are just entitled to as, Western Protestant believers, things which can often be idols for a lot of people. Not saying that those are bad things, but sooner or later, God's plan of salvation history is going to kick in a way which requires young men, young women to instead say, how do I align my life, my purposes, my goals, the work I'm supposed to do with what is impending as it regards the return of the King? That's not often a question we ask ourselves, even in today's Messianic community. Believe me, I know this. All right, November the 5th from Breitbart. This is yesterday. This is a useful clip to review. John Ondrasik, singer of the band Five for Fighting, compared the anti-Semitism of the left and the right, pointing out that those on the right are pundits who don't speak for the majority of conservatives. So that would be people like Candace Owens, possibly Tucker Carlson, definitely Nick Fuentes. But on the left, they are elected leaders of the Democrat Party. Okay, so yes, those of us who are friends and supporters of Israel, the Jewish people, we're offended. We are incensed at what's happening. But if we believe God's plan, that the whole world's going to turn against Israel, and that it's ultimately going to result in the Jewish people crying out to the only one who can genuinely help them. Because as much as if we're a non-Jewish believer in the Messianic community, yes, we're fellow citizens with the saints. We're fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord. We can co-labor with Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel. But ultimately, there has to be a corporate Jewish cry to the Creator God himself. That is what we're going to have to ultimately see. And yes, all of us are supposed to cry out to the Creator God, but that's what is going to have to be seen with the Jewish community, not turning to America, turning to other potential human allies. It's going to have to be seeking out the Lord himself. All right, so Donald Trump yesterday, open source intel, November the 5th, reported this. Trump, the U.S. now has the strongest economy, borders, military friendships, and spirit. This is the golden age of America. I mean, honestly, there are people out there who they believe this. There are other people who think, Trump, you're full of crap. And then there are other people who say, well, let's give Trump a little more time. Let's give him a full year in office. It has been a full year since the election. Let's give him a full year in office to continue to sort through things. But then there's some people who are like, this is going to pave the way for the arrival of the beast, this golden age idea. So we continue to wait and see and monitor, but we definitely pay attention to these kinds of things. How much of what Trump is doing with this golden age is just rhetoric. You want to see America kind of take a few paces back to where we were in the 1990s, have us be more fiscally responsible, pay off the national debt, bring industry back to America, or are you? I mean, what is this golden age thing? All right, from also open source intel, President Trump. This is from yesterday afternoon, 5:08 p.m., and there's a 39-second clip. The United States has more nuclear weapons than any other country. This was accomplished, including a complete update and renovation of existing weapons during my first term. Because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. Yeah. Am I happy with this? No. Does the United States have to do it? Probably. Does testing actually mean that you're going to see detonations out in the Nevada desert? It's not required. It could just be some kind of scientific testing in the laboratory, making sure all the equipment works up to the point of detonation. Of course, we're never going to know because it's all going to be highly classified and highly secret. But this is where we as believers need to pray for world peace. Nuclear war is a very, very bad thing. All right, from the New York Post, another response to the election of Mamdani. This is from yesterday. Parents begin planning to take their kids out of New York City schools minutes after Zohran Mamdani's mayoral win. And this mainly involves presumably various well-to-do families in New York. They're going to send their kids to private schools outside the city. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing where the exit from New York, obviously a lot of Jewish people are concerned, do I need to head for Florida? Do I need to head for Israel? But then there are going to be other people who are like, we've been sending our kid to, good, decent public school. We send them to a private school. What do we do? Are we going to stay here permanently? I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who leave New York because of this. From Newsmax, this is yesterday, November the 5th. ADL launches Mamdani monitor amid fears of anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, announced Wednesday an unprecedented initiative to monitor incoming New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's administration, citing deep concern over his record of anti-Israel statements and associations with figures accused of anti-Semitism. Yeah, a lot of people very concerned, not surprised by this at all. Okay, so speaking of anti-Semitism, speaking of misunderstanding of the Jewish roots, the Hebraic heritage we have in the Tanakh scriptures and Second Temple Judaism, what have you. As you know, these episodes are automatically broken up into different shorts, which we then post mainly to YouTube and Instagram. So we got some feedback yesterday from someone who said, in response to our shared Jewish and Christian heritage, someone said, and I've got to pass this along sometimes, because they aren't the same, and Jews don't respect Christians. They don't believe Jesus exists, and they spit on you in Israel like, WTF, what the frack, that's Battlestar Galactica version of the F word, you trying to prove, bud, that you're falling for it as well? Yeah, we get a lot of different comments. We don't know, I assume that's a human being. We're going to assume that's a real person. There are a lot of different comments from people who say things about our teachings. So this is how I respond. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Jews don't believe Jesus existed. The plenty of Jews who believe Jesus existed historically. Do they recognize him as the Messiah or even a prophet? No. And they spit on you in Israel? So this is how I responded. Do you really believe that all Jews in Israel spit on Christians? There are Christians in the USA who spit on other Christians. Indeed, what you will see on social media, and there's a huge battle taking place right now on social media, and you can't be ignorant of it. And it's from a lot of content creators who have gotten very emboldened post October the 7th, 2023. And some of these people, they were already anti-Semites, they were already anti-Zionists. Some of these people had once strongly supported Israel, the Jewish people, and then for whatever reason or series of reasons, they've decided that I was lied to, I was wrong. Now I can't support Israel or the Jewish people, Zionists, the church is some new Israel, and they'll post little quotes of, a Christian person walking in a very, highly Jewish, religious, Orthodox area in Jerusalem, and they'll be spit at or scoffed in some way. And you see, all Jews in Israel, they spit on Christians. Well, if you're going into an ultra-Orthodox or religious Jewish area, that is a risk you take. But it is naive to think that Christians aren't spit on by Muslims or scoffed at by Muslims, or even that one group of Christians doesn't go after another group of Christians, even here in America. So some of the criticism is, very, very unbalanced. But that is what we should expect to see more and more of. When I went to Israel in 2004, in particular, highly Orthodox areas, I was never spit at. I was never, cursed at. I got some dirty looks, but I could get dirty looks from just about any group of people, at the local Kroger, for example. So this is not often kept in balance regarding just interaction of different human groups in society, in the world at large. Okay, so we definitely have a war raging on social media, and we definitely need to be paying attention to this. And I'm going to preface, before I show you this clip, which came across my Instagram feed last night. And, some of us spend a little too much time on these devices, but Instagram, of course, has this feature where you just click on a video and you can just watch things. TikTok has that feature as well. I got caught in that for about 30 to 40 minutes. And about 90% of what I saw was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist. And it was a lot of the same stuff recycled over and over again. But a lot of people in today's Messianic Jewish movement, congregational leaders, rabbis, they're not aware of any of this. And part of the reason they're not aware of any of this is, and I mean this with all due respect, it's because of their age, right? I don't use social media. I don't use Facebook. I don't use Twitter, X. I don't use this. And so they're not aware of it. And what does it really matter? There was that one person we quoted just a moment ago from Breitbart, John Ondrasik, singer of the band Five for Fighting, compared the anti-Semitism of the left and right, pointing out that those on the right are pundits who don't speak for the majority of conservatives, meaning that they're just on social media. They're not the majority. But this is what we have to remember. The younger people, they do use these devices, and they are influenced by what they see regarding Israel, the Jewish people, Judaism, etc. Oh, John, you're overreacting to this. Am I? How many of these young people have gotten into LGBTQ because of what? This crap. How many of these people got into things they shouldn't be getting into precisely because of the electronic devices? I mean, look, I remember, all the way back in 1997, 1998, when I was working at the movie theater, as a consequence of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky doing theater checks and seeing people I was a fellow student of, I was in class with, experimenting in the dark theater. Okay? I'm just going to leave it at that. So don't be so naive. All right, so this is something which should get us very, very upset. And this is from, let me get his name. This is from Owen Schroyer, who apparently used to work with Alex Jones. And he is saying that in 10 to 20 years, support for Israel will be gone from the United States of America. He's saying that the U.S. only has about 10 to 20 more years of support for Israel. And of course, in the comments, there's some people are saying it will take no longer than 1 to 2 years. And mainly what he's crediting this with is that the baby boomer generation, which a lot of people think, you've been influenced by dispensational theology, people like Hal Lindsey, late great planet Earth, pre-trib rapture, reconstruction of the third temple, and that you got to support Israel because of your end time. They're all going to be dead. And those who are coming after, they've wised up that Israel's a pariah state. It's been sucking money from the United States of America, all the typical sound bites. But this is something we need to pay attention to. This is probably not going to be the last time something like this runs across my feed. Now, he's saying objectively, U.S. support for Israel is only going to last another 10 to 20 years. So the question is, as I have thought about this, what are we going to see in parallel development as it involves North American Messianic Judaism? Are we going to see it multiply? Are we going to see it only be able to duplicate itself? Or are we going to see it on some kind of a managed decline? Likewise, if you are a young parent, I've got a nephew who is going to be turning 4 in the next month and a half or so. And you're in the Messianic community, how are you preparing your sons and daughters for the future here in the United States and for what is a noticeable decline of support for Israel, the Jewish people, and Zionism? How are you going to align them to God's plan for the future? I mean, these are very serious questions, and these are very serious issues. And just like I pointed out yesterday, the post from Nick Fuentes, this is the kind of post you need to watch, and you need to ask the Lord, okay, regardless of the specific timetables, could it be sooner? Yes. Could it be a little longer? Yes. But this is someone saying, first time I've really seen it, 10 to 20 years, U.S. support for Israel is going to evaporate. So in the meantime, what are we supposed to do? We can't act as though it's business as usual. The fallout from October the 7th, 2023 is real. Okay, so we got 3 more news stories to go through. Okay, here's something that's got a lot of people upset. 33-second clip forwarded on from open source intel. A New York Muslim influencer who campaigned for Zohran Mamdani is now promoting videos saying the Islamic Caliphate in New York starts now, adding, "We are all converting to Islam. Mosques will be built on every single block." She's also excited that she already got someone to convert to Islam yesterday. And remember, this is only a mere 24 years after 9/11. Never forget, but many people did. All right, so this is a useful article to peruse from My Charisma. It's actually from CBN News. The title is Conservatives Confront Rising Anti-Semitism Within GOP Ranks and Existential Crisis. So please, like we've definitely been, keeping people up to date on some of the things which have been put out by Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes now, Owen Schroyer now. We need to be aware of this. But in the case of today's Messianic Jewish community, which usually, and I mean this again with a lot of love and respect, tends to be more behind the curve than ahead of it. Hopefully an article like this, because whether you like Charisma or not, it is the most frequently read publication by people across the Messianic spectrum. Hopefully this will get some leaders, some teachers to wake up to the severity of the situation right now here in North America. Okay, now we're going to close with this story. This is from Open Source Intel. There's a 9-second clip. That's Benjamin Netanyahu where he said, the reason I could withstand the storm is that I knew that if I capitulated to it, there would be no Israel. It's as simple as that. And I am going to say this regarding Netanyahu. I do believe he was the right leader for the right time. We don't know all of the intel, all of the information given to him any more than we know all the intel and information given to President Trump or others. And he had to make decisions that would keep, in his mind, Israel going. The decisions made regarding October the 7th, 2023, as more information comes out, are going to be debated right indefinitely. People still debate about whether the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, went the right way, right? So, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Vietnam, people are still debating, why did we do this when we could have done that, right? And that's going to be the case with October the 7th, 2023. Did Israel not do enough in going after the hostages? Did they do too much? But in our case, because we do hold to a biblical worldview, we recognize from the record of the historical books that the kingdom of ancient Israel had good leaders, not so good leaders, good victories, bad defeats. That's part of Israel's story, even into the modern period. But we also know that whatever is being orchestrated, the ultimate end is so, rather than looking for a human solution to the problem, a human solution to why is the world coming against us, that Israel, in this case, the ethnic Jewish people, will unite together and they will seek the only one who can help them, God himself. And it will have to involve a huge amount of repentance. It will have to involve a huge amount of confession. And especially, as we all know, they will look on him whom they have pierced. Now, along with that, I want to add, and I actually did post something on this on X last night, because you see a lot of these, content creators on a platform, in my case, Instagram, who are out there pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, anti-Zionism, anti-Judaism. They're cherry picking things from the Talmud and all this. They don't have any religious studies or biblical training to speak of. But while we condemn what they say, while we condemn their conclusions, while we know they are biased, and while we know that they are not operating with a full deck, as it were, do we pray for some of these social media influencers? Yes, we want them to be, their message to be neutralized and for the truth to come out. But do we actually pray that, Lord, would you supernaturally appear to some of these people like you did to Paul on the Damascus Road? He asked Paul, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Right? And Paul was supernaturally transformed, and he went to declare the very message he was trying to destroy. So, do we pray to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Yeshua, would you appear to some of these anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish social media influencers? Why are you persecuting me and my people? Do you know who I am? Do you know where I am returning? Do you know what it means for me to rule with a rod of iron from Jerusalem and have them come to their senses? Do we pray that? I don't suspect many of us do pray for that. And I think we need to be much more aware of that as things get darker and darker, because we are in a battle. Forces of light, forces of darkness. And the end times are about the forces of light. They're about the return of the king. They are about the restoration of Israel. And yes, we support the state of Israel, but it's a secular, widely atheistic country. Yes, there are many people who are religious there too. But it's only one installment toward the ultimate Messianic kingdom. And we have to keep that in mind. And with that, as representatives of that kingdom whose power is already breaking in our own lives as spiritually transformed men and women, we need to say, Lord, supernaturally appear to some of these content creators as you did to Paul on the Damascus road. Why are you persecuting my people? Do you know who I truly am as the Lion of the tribe of Judah? Do you know where I am returning? I'm not returning to Rome, I'm not returning to New York or Washington, I'm returning to Jerusalem. And that's not just some metaphorical symbol. So we need to keep this in mind as we contemplate the future. All right. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. If you have not already, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions entries. You can take a look into some back episodes of Messianic Insider, back issues of Outreach Israel News, different McKee moment shorts, etc. You can take a look at our activities and adventures over the years. And please, if you have not already, be sure to give this live stream a thumbs up or a heart. It will help its exposure on social media. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you. Shalom, and take care.